So my name's Sam Bartlett. I am a director at the Green Hydrogen Organisation. I have two responsibilities. One is for this, the Green Hydrogen Standard. I'll explain a little bit about it in a moment. And my other responsibility is around corporate engagement, which is what we've been doing all week, bringing together industry representatives from around the world. We almost have a all-female panel. I'm the odd man out. We also were expecting to have Johanna from GIZ join us. She's unfortunately feeling unwell, so we have a slightly smaller panel, but that'll be fine. I'd like to ask my fellow panelists to introduce themselves, perhaps starting with you, Elizabeth.
So hello everyone, my name is Elisabeth Titel. I am responsible for global government affairs at ThyssenKrupp nucera. And ThyssenKrupp nucera is the electrolyzer company of ThyssenKrupp. So we are the electrolyzer guys, I must say guys, because it's so far 470 guys and another female colleague and me. and we only do the big plans. So whenever you plan on going big, think of ThyssenKrupp nucera.
Rachel.
Hi everyone, Rachel Fakhri. I lead the hydrogen work for the UN High-Level Champions, but also am seconded from the Natural Resources Defense Council, which is a big climate NGO based in the US, also leading the hydrogen work and doing a lot of work on standards and so on. So this is near and dear to my heart.
Hi, I'm Barbara Jinks from IRENA, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency. We have 168 countries that are members, and we do deep dives into technical issues, and then we make policy recommendations based on science. And we also, a big part of our job is just getting 184 countries talking at the table about the key issues about renewables, and including green hydrogen. And we've supported this initiative since the beginning. Thanks.
Great. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining. So I'm going to kick things off, and I promise I'm not going to talk too much today. But I thought I'd start with just a few minutes about first of all, about the Green Hydrogen Organisation, which is a relatively new organisation. I joined in September last year and was given the challenge, as Todd put it, to be bold and to sort of step into this space. And it was quite clear that when people were talking about green hydrogen, often they were talking about very different things. That's without even getting into the different definitions of clean hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen and all the colors of the rainbow. But there was a group of industry, government and civil society leaders basically challenged us to say, put down a marker and establish a global definition of green hydrogen, which is not a straightforward thing to do. Because there are some controversies, and we're going to touch on some of them today, I'm sure. But essentially what we've done is quite simple. And it's very much standing on the shoulders of work that's been done over many decades. Our standard has three pillars. The first relates to emissions. Our standard sets a threshold of 1 kilo CO2 equivalent per kilo of hydrogen. We can talk a lot about that, about the emissions boundary and so forth. But that's based on the work that the IPHE and others have done. There's an emerging global consensus on how you can measure emissions in different hydrogen production pathways. We're focused on electrolysis, using renewable electricity. It's often sort of characterized as zero emissions. From a technocratic perspective, we think that's it's appealing from a kind of PR perspective, but there are some important aspects of emissions that need to be quantified and measured carefully. So our first pillar is establishing some benchmarks and some methods for measuring emissions. The second pillar is building on, and it was great to listen into the previous panel talking about the lessons learned, particularly from the extractive industries, on the environmental, social, and governance performance. And one of the things that was fascinating about that previous panel is none of them talked about emissions at all. It was all about when they were talking about good contracting, they were talking about good governance, community engagement. And because this is the green hydrogen industry is in its infancy, most of these projects are not yet at final investment decision. We haven't yet seen the controversies that we've seen in the mining sector and the oil and gas sector, but they are coming. So it was very clear to us from the outset that, yes, we needed to look at the emissions profile. We needed to demonstrate that green hydrogen was close to zero emissions. But this second pillar on the social, environmental, social, and governance performance of green hydrogen projects was as obvious needed to be addressed. And then the third element, which was also mentioned in the previous panel, on the, if you look at the portfolio of green hydrogen projects around the world, more than half of them are in developing and emerging economies. And again, these questions about, these are not like discovering a new oil field and everyone thinks they're going to get rich. These are not super profitable projects that are going to lead to large tax revenues, at least not in the short run. So there's very important questions around, well, what's in it for these countries? And again, if we don't measure or manage the environmental and social and governance risks, would we be doing more harm than good? So what we've done in the standard, and there's copies floating around, is we've built on things like the IFC safeguards. We've built on the Sustainable Development Goals, and we've tried in a very concise way to essentially set out some principles about what it means to be a green hydrogen producer. I'll be the first one to put my hand up and say that this first draft is not perfect. There are things that we haven't given enough attention to. But the process, we sort of kick things off, it's been quite an extraordinary journey. The standard was announced in November. We brought together a group of stakeholders in December, and here we are in May. So we've developed this standard, taking again Todd's challenge to be bold and just, it was tempting to say to the team, we need 3 years to do this. This is so complicated. There's so much existing work we need to build on. So it's been a bit of a white knuckle ride, trying to sort of move quickly, to be bold, and yeah, to stand on the shoulders of people that have been working on these issues for decades, and to put down a marker and say, this is a basis for discussion so that when globally we're talking about green hydrogen, we can start to have a common language. So I'll leave my introduction there. I'd now like to ask each of you, there are many different facets to this work, but for you and your organizations, perhaps to highlight one aspect that we've been working on over the last couple of months that you think is particularly important in developing a global approach to green hydrogen standardization. So perhaps Elizabeth, if you'd like to go first.
Yes, ThyssenKrupp Nucera is a global company, and we plan to cooperate with international partners in more than 90 countries. So for us, it's really important that we have, as you just mentioned, one common language, that we all speak about the same thing when we speak about green hydrogen, so that regardless of where the project is located, in no matter what country, everybody speaks about the same thing when we speak about green hydrogen. And yes, this is important to us. And so we really try not only to provide electrolysis, but we would also like to shape this new hydrogen era. And this is why ThyssenKrupp has been partnering with the Green Hydrogen Organization right from the start, and is represented at the board of the Green Hydrogen Organization by our CEO, Mrs. Merz.
And hopefully you can also convince some of the customers of your electrolyzers to implement the standard. That would be great too.
This is what we actually plan. We will inform our partners that there is the green hydrogen standard, and that they can either get in touch with you if they want to, or it's through me. So we will sort of share the information and make it publicly available.
I'll come back to the next steps in the end, but Rachel, on to you next. I mean, you've been in this field for longer than I have. You know, what excites you about this work?
Absolutely. First of all, congratulations, Sam. It was a Herculean effort on your part. I remember, you know, just the strenuous meetings that we would have, and it was all you driving all the work. So really, congratulations. You know, to me, I'm from a climate organization, right? And all we think about is climate crisis, how do you address this? I think this is an incredible marker, what we put. I work in the US, the amount of nebulousness around green hydrogen, around what it means, everyone has their own definition. Just having that global marker, I can already see the ripple effects into, you know, nation-specific conversations, even if they don't adopt it. I think it's already shaping the conversation in a very good direction. And I think what I'm excited about with this standard is that, one, it was very difficult to put together because this is an industry that is so nascent, that has so many facets that we still don't understand. And yeah, we had to put our stakes on the ground, right, on so many different issues that are still very difficult to predict. And yet it struck that, I think, balance between rigor but nimbleness really well, in particular as it relates to, you know, how do you verify the sourcing of the renewable electricity, which is front of mind for a lot of us. And I know the Delegated Act in Europe will also provide some guidance. The way it currently positions itself as, look, we can't mandate this across the board, but we're going to take it very seriously. And we're going to input a lot of rigor in how we evaluate it, and the public consultation baked into it, and that the public will be able to weigh in. I think there's so much learning that we can do from this standard just by sheer virtue of learning how projects are approaching this. I think there's just so much learning that we could do to start honing in policies better and better. So really fantastic start. And I'm really excited to see how it's going to shape the conversation.
Great, thanks. One of the, I guess, sort of methodological challenges that we encountered right from the outset was that, you know, they said that if it's 70% or 80% of the cost is the renewable electricity, that's also where maybe 70 or 80% of the impact is. So it was great to have ARENA involved from the outset also, because, you know, there are decades of learning about the same issues in the renewable energy space. And the green hydrogen standard work obviously needs to link up with that. So Barbara, tell us a little bit about, you know, your involvement in the project, and also what aspects of it are most interesting from ARENA's perspective.
Yeah, again, it's what Elizabeth and Rachel have said, which is that it's something to hang our hat on. It sets a benchmark. And when you've got 184 countries around the table, you need to have some sort of starting point or some sort of threshold. And it definitely is making that division between blue and green. I mean, that's a very important factor, I know, for many organizations. And it's the, now, is that your phone, Sam?
I hope not.
There's a phone ringing.
I think it might be you, Elizabeth.
And it distinguishes, it cuts through the dialogue of low carbon, blue or green, and then it sets that ambitious level. And I think that was very important. For us, it's all about scientific credibility, and then just collaboration, talking, having dialogue. Even if some countries absolutely disagree with it, at least you have the dialogue, and they have to have a rationale why they disagree with it. So it's a tool. Very quickly, we see it most importantly as a tool for dialogue and for having those discussions, and for high ambition, which is what we promote with hydrogen, is what we acknowledge, that there are countries that cannot achieve this, but it's a pathway, it's a journey to achieving it as well.
Yeah, I think I'm waiting for someone to put their hand up and ask the question about how does this relate to Repower EU that's been announced today, and the Delegated Act and so forth. You know, we had in our technical committee, we had 30 people. We had quite strong representation from Europe, because I think that's where the discussion around hydrogen policy is very well advanced, and there's a lot of a lot of controversy of sort of green versus blue and additionality issues and so forth. And that influenced our work very heavily. But then there's also a hydrogen debate in the US, which is, Rachel, you helped us understand the nuances there. There's a vibrant discussion in Latin America and in Australia. And Rachel, you touched on this point about how do you write a global standard when countries are at very different stages in this kind of journey? And a 1 megawatt solar project in Townsville, which you can learn about in the expo hall, is a very different proposition from a 100 megawatt project in Northern Norway. The issues are very, very different. So how do you write a global standard that is fit for purpose in very, very different contexts? So that's another sort of challenge that we've been wrestling with. Look, I'll leave that first half of the sort of session there and open it up. We launched this yesterday. You've basically had a day to flick through this standard and say, well, that's a bit strange or that's a bit unusual. One of the things, and I swear this is the last thing I'll say as an introduction. One thing we heard from industry was we need certainty. We're about to make huge investments. So if we're going to sign up for a certification process, you can't move the goalposts in 3 years. And there's another group of people saying, well, if that's going to be the case, then we need another 3 years to agree what the rules are going to be. So we've had to sort of strike a balance there and say, this is a standard that will evolve. We will agree different policy notes on particular issues as we learn. But it won't be possible to be part of the first group of projects that get certified, and then you get a stamp of approval in perpetuity. As the standard evolves, as projects evolve, as a project goes from 10 megawatts to 100 megawatts to 300 megawatts, projects will have to go through the certification process again as their impacts change. So it's been a fascinating journey. We've got a great foundation, and we're delighted with the sort of response that we've received, in particular from green hydrogen producers saying we're ready to subject our projects to independent scrutiny. And as part of that, again, as mentioned in the previous panel, is around transparency and stakeholder engagement. This is not a black box exercise where you send a dossier off to Jonas and me in Switzerland and we give you a stamp of approval. It's a fundamentally consultative exercise that requires engagement with stakeholders in the communities that will host these projects.
It'd be interesting, did anyone get involved or look at it on the internet when it was issued as a draft for consultation? Okay, 1, 2, 3, well done. Okay, 4, yeah, 5, 6, 7, 8.
There's been about 1,000 phone calls in the last 6 months but we've benefited so much from people from different fields jumping in, and it might only be with one sentence saying, you don't need to reinvent the wheel here. There's an existing standard. It could be on an issue like contract transparency, where there's Gavin, he's still around, so he gave me a quick call and said, Sam, I can help, and jumped into the Google Doc and improved it. So we've benefited enormously from at least 50 or 60 people that have got their fingerprints on this document, and we're greatly appreciative to everyone involved. So questions, comments, well, let's open it up. I'm going to sort of do some roving, like in... So please introduce yourself and yeah.
It's working. And thanks for coming so fast. Luis Viga from Frost Skill Feeder Industries from Brazil. I want the panel to talk a little bit about the additionality, if you can give your opinion and about the certification.
Who wants to kick that off? Rachel, you're smiling.
Unfortunately, additionality is more on my mind these days than anything else, which is very sad.
Maybe you could explain, because I
Sure.
think there's some people that know heaps about additionality and some people who probably never heard that word before. So-
Absolutely. Hydrogen uses a lot of power to be produced. So there's always a concern that if you don't have rigorous rules around making sure that the power is clean, it could increase emissions on the grid. And additionality has become one of the major tools for ensuring renewable sourcing, because essentially it requires that an electrolyzer, when it locates on the grid, that it kind of brings its own renewable supply with it, either by directly co-locating with a new wind and solar farm, or locate on the grid, but sign a contract with a new wind and solar farm, subject to some restrictions around location and so on. And that's additionality. And it's become a very heated debate because you have the proponents and the opponents. Opponents largely think it's too onerous for an industry that's still, creeping up and growing, because it would add a lot of cost to hydrogen producers to have to secure new renewable energy. Proponents say, well, this is so inefficient that we cannot risk having higher emissions on the grid. We need rigor, and additionality can give you that. Where we stand, I will put on my non-UN high-level champions hat, because I do this as part of my other NRDC work. We see additionality as the easiest way of dealing with a very complex issue. We run into a lot of complexity when we start thinking about, okay, additionality aside, how can we demonstrate that an electrolyzer is not going to increase emissions on the grid by increasing, coal and gas dispatch, for instance? It becomes complicated really, really fast. And I think that over time, maybe we can become sharper and find a way to do it without additionality, because at some point you will have, if we keep increasing renewables on the system, you're going to have a lot of wasted renewables, which would be good to use, and that's great, but we're not there yet, at least not in the US. I don't know if there's a place in the world, besides Australia maybe, that has a lot of wasted power today. So we think additionality is the easiest way today of making sure you're not increasing emissions. But I would say this with an asterisk, that we are still thinking about how to become sharper at it. So right now we are requesting additionality, but also thinking about how do we become more precise and maybe not require it all the time, but in some situations. So all this to say, and I think the standard does this really well. It's very rigorous, and it expects that projects will not increase emissions on the system. It expects projects to demonstrate, if they're not showing additionality, to show how they're not increasing emissions on the grid, but it's not, mandating it. Which is what I said earlier. We have so much more learning to do around how do you demonstrate renewable sourcing without additionality, that I cannot wait to see what comes out of this, right? The consultation process and so on. We can learn a lot, and maybe we can become sharper at that. But I think as a starting point, it's a very safe tool, even though it's not very popular with industry yet.
Elizabeth?
Yes, from an industry perspective, we recognize that additionality is a complex issue, and that what for us key is that we need to speed up the ramp up of the green hydrogen economy, and it must not be a trade-off, additionality versus speed. So this is not something we would like to get caught in.
I think I'd add to that, we also don't want to pave the way for blue hydrogen to ramp up, and for demand for hydrogen that's low carbon, and green hydrogen is stalled at the gates because of something like additionality. So we have to be really careful, and I agree, but I think we should really monitor it. And this is not particularly an arena position, but just a common sense position, my common sense position. We have to monitor it literally month by month and say, is this working? Is it not? And really don't wait for 5 years. And meanwhile, there's blue being imported all over the place.
Yeah, maybe I'll add my 20 cents on this. I think, so this is an issue, it's a hot topic in Europe. We're all expecting today a delegated act from the European Commission that would set out the rules, and it hasn't been published yet. And we understand it might be published tomorrow, but we'll see.
Isn't that normal?
Yeah. So I'm not familiar with the with the issues in Brazil. I know that there are, in Australia, for example, in different parts of the energy market in Australia, there's different challenges in different states. There's certainly in Scandinavia, Norway and Sweden, in different parts of the country, you can have a surplus of renewable electricity and other parts not. So how does the standard deal with this? I think we've handled it in a smart way by actually stepping back. This is not a standard for countries. It's not a standard for companies. It's a project level standard. And what we ask each project developer to do is to ask the question, what is the impact? If your project is going to be connected to the grid, what is the impact of your project going to be? On emissions, on prices, on grid stability. There's a whole range of issues there. So additionality is one issue, but there's a whole set of them. So we believe that it's good corporate governance for a project developer to step back and look at those issues holistically. If there's a national requirement, if the European Commission sets out a additionality requirement, well, of course that has to be respected. You know, that's common sense. If there's national regulations and requirements, then they all need to be followed. But so we've tried to step back from the additionality issue and look at some of the issues around pricing, for example. And let me frame it in a different way. If you're doing a small green hydrogen project in a large liquid market, you're not going to have any impact at all. But if you're doing a huge green hydrogen project in a small market where there's no tradition of power purchase agreements, you're going to have a huge impact on the local electricity market. Emissions are important, but you're going to have a big impact on the prices for other consumers. If you don't get those issues right, then you're going to very quickly have all kinds of issues with your sort of social license to operate. So this is one thing that I'm sure we're going to have a lot of, as we roll this out and we test this on different projects with different technologies and different scales, then we'll come back to this. But that's how we've approached it in this first iteration. Next question.
Hi, Dominic Eagleton from the NGO Global Witness. Yeah, the point about, let's not have additionality because we'll just let the blue hydrogen producers in. I mean, one of the things that I, thought about that is that, there's a real risk that you're going to end up producing hydrogen that's worse in terms of climate impact than blue hydrogen. And actually a question I had was, it seems to me that I'm not even sure now that additionality is really even in this, even in this standard, really. It seems there's a requirement to do an evaluation. And then there's just an expectation that the project operator has identified and implemented technically feasible and cost-effective measures to support the deployment of additional renewable energy capacity. That's I think it's fair enough to say that's quite a weak version of additionality. And I completely get your point about it being different in different markets. So for sure, but the thing is, the point, if it ends up, with the production of so-called green hydrogen that is actually more polluting, that's, it's creating more emissions than it's, stopping, which is the whole point of the industry, then, I mean, that argument that it's just as worse as, worse than blue hydrogen. So, but just the question is really then, I mean, it's a lot of it's about the indirect emissions that come from not having additionality. You're firing up gas or coal power stations, potentially, or quite likely to do that. So when it comes to the methodology for identifying whether it's a kilo, under a kilo of greenhouse gas emissions, does the standards factor in those indirect emissions that arise from, let's say, not having additionality, as it's not required? So
let me answer that as directly, not as rigorously as Global Witness would like, I think, is the answer to that question. you have to meet this 1 kilo threshold. So you'll have to have a power purchasing agreement that you can show that you're using 100% renewable electricity and you're falling below that 1 kilo threshold. The question about the kind of indirect impact, I guess my answer to that would be, that's a grid level problem to be solved by the regulator, not a problem to be solved by just one of the consumers in that grid. I'm not saying that they should be completely blind to that or oblivious to it, but looking for a solution at the grid level from just one of the consumers, unless it's a consumer that's going to account for 80% of the consumption, which might happen in some big green hydrogen projects. So have we magically in 5 months solved the challenge of additionality? No. But we've tried to approach it in a pragmatic and constructive way. And you talked about, we have 3 levels. There are lots of provisions in here. Some of them are optional. They say, we encourage you to look at this issue, but it's not a requirement. At the other extreme, it's a clear red line. You have to meet this requirement or you won't be accredited or certified. And in the middle, there's this idea of expectations. What that means is the burden of proof is on the green hydrogen project operator to demonstrate that they've considered the issues, they've looked at different alternatives, and they've put forward a credible approach. Now, the $50 million question is, who decides what's credible? And there's a whole bunch of governance issues here about how the certification process will work and who gives the final stamp of approval. Because some projects will be uncontroversial, but some of them are going to be very controversial. So there's a bunch of work to do. And if you're interested in this stuff from a governance perspective, because we have work to do at GH2, we're a new organization. We've established our board, we have a secretariat, but we also need to put in place the institutions to accredit validators, to receive these reports, to receive complaints. There's a lot of work ahead to put the institutional arrangements in place so that those kinds of value judgments, which are an inevitable part of this exercise, that they're subject to credible, independent assurance. And we welcome people challenging us to demonstrate that we've got robust systems in place to do that. I think I'm going to put an additional ban on additionality questions. So no additional additionality. Let's move on to some other issues. Sam.
Whilst we're waiting for the next question, I think we also have to assume that the intent is honourable. That there won't be projects that are intending to trick the system and click into coal and gas. The intent will be clear to do the right thing under the standard.
Hi, I'm Sam from FFI. Look, I think this is a great piece of work. I'm so pleased to see this and read the content of it. My question, it's a pretty pragmatic one, really, just about helping people understand it. Because I know if I look through requirement 4, that'll make sense to me because that's my bread and butter. But how can you perhaps help project teams understand what this actually requires of them? What's the work behind this to be accredited down the track? Because there's quite a bit behind a lot of these words. So I was just wondering if there was anything in place or planned for that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I think it's a bit buried in here. If you're working on a green hydrogen project and you're interested in these issues, the going through the whole certification process, particularly if it's a large green hydrogen project, will be a time-consuming exercise. But one of the things we're keen to do is to convert this into a tool that can be used at an early stage, during the pre-feasibility stage, before final investment decision, so that when governments, companies, or communities are exploring the opportunities for green hydrogen, they can make use of this tool. Again, I'll use my new home in Northern Norway. If you're doing a project in Northern Norway, the big issues are, community support and in particular, Indigenous community engagement. There are existing national rules on access to water resources, environmental impact assessment. So one of the things the standard does is sort of says, if there are national regulations that are in line with international best practice, then you can quickly kind of tick those boxes. But we want the certification process to focus on the issues that are most important, most relevant in that community. So if it's a wind power project in Northern Norway, it's about Indigenous community engagement, some issues around water resource utilization, and just general community acceptance. And the question of, well, how, you know, there's not going to be super profitable projects. So what's in it for the community, for the host community? Is that some kind of royalty, property taxes and things like that? So we want to, but if you're doing a solar project in Namibia, next to a national park, in a water stressed environment, completely different set of issues. So we will convert this into a kind of a rapid assessment tool. So as companies are evaluating new projects, and especially in the next few months as we're rolling this out, if you'd like to put your hand up and do a kind of virtual accreditation exercise on one of your projects, drop me an email and we'll set that up. Up the back. Well, and well, I'll come back. I'm getting some exercise, which is good. Cheers.
So Max Hewitt from Hydrogen Australia. I'll just also use this opportunity to pass on the thanks from my colleagues, Scott Hamilton and Simon Dawes, who were involved in the development of the standard. It's a hugely important piece of work. My question is, how do you envisage that the standard and eventually the scheme will operate for those projects, and in particular those jurisdictions that already have a scheme in place? For example, the low carbon ammonia scheme, the renewable energy directive work, the zero carbon certification scheme. Will developers need to repeat the certification process? Would the certification be transferable, or would there be some other sort of process to go through?
Thanks. I think while walking back, I think one of the challenges that we had is that there was no sort of perfect time to do this. We're thinking, oh, maybe we should wait until the delegated act from the European Commission comes out, but we still don't know when that's going to happen. It could be tomorrow, it could be 2 weeks from now. In the US, there's some really important legislation on production tax credits. And they set a threshold of 0.45 kilos, I think, to get the highest subsidy. There are existing national schemes in Australia and other places. So we've tried to build on some of the lessons from that work, but we're definitely interested in looking at ways of how our standard could perhaps influence the further development of national schemes, and that we will look at what's working and try to integrate those lessons into a global scheme. When it comes to specifics, we've had a couple of countries and hydrogen associations come to us and say, we want to kind of be the national representative for this standard in our country. We want to be the ones that are, we want to be involved in accrediting the assurance providers. So we need to look at those kinds of models. But before we get too carried away with that, one of the things, our board did two things when it agreed this standard. It said, we're going to push out this standard, and we're going to establish a multi-stakeholder advisory group to help us put some of those institutional safeguards in place. So if you're interested in the kind of the substance, like the specific requirements, we'd love to work with you. But if you're interested in this from a governance perspective, how do we set this up so that it's trusted and that it's credible? We'd really like to talk to you, because that's where we're keen to make sure that we set in place the governance arrangements so that we can have this be credible at the global level, but also effective in very, very different national contexts.
Okay, thank you. So we know that all the matter here about the level of emissions that will be contained in or the level of emission that will be caused by every molecule of hydrogen produced. And I'm afraid we may not have a hydrogen that is 100% pure, of any emission. Even if we look at the gray carbon that is already in the fabrication process of the equipment and in the construction, everything. So how are you going to track the level of emission that is involved in every molecule of hydrogen to be sure it's green? And will you be using sort of blockchain for that or any other mechanisms? Thank you.
Great. I'll have a go at summarizing, which I think is one of the most interesting parts of the technical committee's work in the last few months, is trying to sketch out the system boundary for measuring emissions and what kind of approach is in here. And to simplify it, and I'm not sure the sort of scope 1, 2, 3 schema always makes sense, but so there are some small emissions associated with the electrolysis process itself, not least if you have backup systems, if you're using desalination. So there's the kind of, if you think of it in terms of the electrolysis facility, then you also have there are often some emissions associated with the electricity source itself. One of the things that IPHE methodology says, if it's renewable energy, you can assume the emissions are zero. We think that's wrong. And we know it's wrong. If you're using hydropower, for example, there are some small but significant greenhouse gas emissions associated with hydropower, and you should count those. So that's one area where we kind of disagree with IPHE. And you also touched on this question of embodied emissions. If you're building a new hydropower plant and you're using millions of tons of concrete, that's an extraordinary greenhouse footprint associated with that. So there's more work to do. So our initial threshold is based on the scope 1 and scope 2. So the emissions associated with, any emissions associated with the electrolysis process, plus any emissions associated from the electricity. But we are encouraging projects to quantify those embodied emissions. And we are expecting also downstream the conversion to ammonia, transportation costs. Because if you want to export green hydrogen or green ammonia to Rotterdam, you're going to need to know not just your production emissions, but also your conversion and your transportation emissions. So we need, alongside this, I'm glad you mentioned blockchain, we need also a data standard. Because if you're a green hydrogen developer and you're following this standard, then you'll need to know for each, whether you've got a production run or each batch, you'll need to know its emissions profile, and you'll need to communicate that to your customer and to regulators. So we need a common data standard. We need a language so that we can make that information available, and that information isn't lost. Because if that ammonia then goes off into a green steel maker, they'll need to report that information further down the value chain as well. So we need to find smart ways of capturing this information so that in complex supply chains, we're not losing information along the way. We are running out of time because, as usual, I talk too much. I'd like to give, I know, but I can't help myself. So I'd like to be quiet again and give you all an opportunity to give us a closing reflection. We're at the start of a long journey with green hydrogen. When you think about this in terms of, what's an issue that's perhaps a sleeper issue that we haven't talked about today, but something that's on your radar for something that we need to give close attention to over the coming years. Elizabeth, would you like to go first?
I'm sure that's on everyone's radar, but nevertheless, I would like to mention that for us, public-private partnerships are key, because we can only meet this challenge together by working closely together. And from a ThyssenKrupp Nucera perspective, we are engaged in several public-private partnerships, because this is, for example, to mention the FFI-led G7 task force on green hydrogen, where ThyssenKrupp Nucera is also actively participating and promoting an import boost for Australian green hydrogen into Europe. And I think there will be much more opportunities ahead, and we are looking forward to cooperating on many fronts, so to say.
Great. Rachel.
I think for me, the two things I would like to keep my eye on moving forward, not going to touch on additionality anymore, but really excited about this one to see how it plays out. Two, the transport emissions. The impacts of hydrogen leakage are becoming more and more front and center. UK government commissioned a study that found that leakage from hydrogen can cause serious climate impacts if not mitigated. And we don't really know how to measure it yet because we don't have necessary technology to do so just yet. And we want to develop a technology for sure, but it's really unclear when it would be ready. So transport emissions, because pipelines are particularly prone to leakage because hydrogen is a very small molecule. I think transport emissions are becoming more and more important. So what I worry about is that a resource that fully meets the current production standard and comes across as being clean, green, climate aligned, actually in a few years when we start looking at transport emissions, it ends up being misaligned with climate goals. And we're stuck with long-lived assets. So that's something I'm particularly concerned about. I know there's significant, commitment to look at transport emissions soon, and hopefully we can push on the sensor around leakage and the technologies we need to detect and repair it. But that's something I'm particularly keeping an eye on.
Great. And Barbara?
I guess from my side, it's to reiterate what Elizabeth said, which is the private-public dialogue. And IRENA, although our members are countries, we have collaborative frameworks, and that's where we bring industry and our member representatives together, and we have a collaborative framework for green hydrogen. So I'll be really looking at the adoption of this and the comments of this, and I'm thinking we should have some sort of workshop with our members on it. And yesterday we agreed with ThyssenKrupp that we'll have a strategic partnership agreement. So it's all about that dialogue and the uptake. Let's see what the response is. Whether it's whether you get interest, whether you get some dummy runs or some real runs, or whether you I think now that it's launched, you maybe get more comments on it, which is Murphy's Law after you've known. So we'll be just watching to see how it's, and from our members, what the reaction is from our members. Be very interesting.
Yeah. Well, then I'll close by thanking you all for joining today. Thank you for your support during this sort of first sprint to get the first version of this standard out. And just welcome anyone that's sort of been following this that would like to be involved, either on a specific specialist topic that really excites them. It could be free, prior and informed consent. It could be additionality. It could be, what about offsets? No one's mentioned nuclear power today, which is great. Because I'm sick of answering questions about that, but that's definitely a sensitive and challenging topic. So there's a lot of hard work ahead. If you're interested in using this standard or helping us strengthen it further, get in touch. And thanks for joining today. And please thank the panelists for their time.